Hello and welcome. Before we begin, a promise. This video is designed for sleep. No mid-roll advertisements for the first 60 minutes. Plenty of time to drift off undisturbed. Tonight we journey to a stone farmhouse in the English Midlands to January 1720 to understand how ordinary people survived winter before central heating existed. The temperature outside is below freezing. Inside, the kitchen fire burns steadily, banked overnight and revived at dawn. The walls are stone, 14 inches thick. The windows are small. The household is awake, beginning the daily work of maintaining warmth. This is the story of how pre-modern households stayed warm: the architecture, the fuel, the fire management, the clothing, the beds, and the food that made winter survival possible. The techniques that sustained human life in cold climates for thousands of years before the invention of the thermostat. But before we continue into the methods and materials, if you find value in these technical historical deep dives, please subscribe to the channel. Your support helps create more ad-free content designed for sleep and contemplation. And I am always curious, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Share in the comments below. Now, settle in. Let us begin with the architecture. Picture the stone farmhouse on that January morning in 1720. The walls are the first line of defense against the cold. They were built with warmth in mind, though their builders would not have used that phrase. They would have said the house was built well. The stone came from a quarry less than 2 miles away. The men who shaped it knew exactly what they were doing, even if they could not have named the physical principles at work. They built walls 14 inches thick, and those walls do something remarkable. They store heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. This is called thermal mass. It is one of the most important building principles in human history, and it operated in farmhouses across England long before anyone wrote it down in a textbook. Limestone was the stone of choice across the Cotswolds and the Midlands. 1 cubic foot of good limestone stores approximately 25 British thermal units of heat for every degree Fahrenheit of temperature difference between inside and outside. A wall 14 inches thick contains nearly 12 cubic feet of stone per square foot of wall area. When you multiply that across the 4 walls of a farmhouse kitchen measuring 12 feet by 14 feet with 8-foot ceilings, you have a structure capable of absorbing and radiating a very significant quantity of heat over many hours. The wall that feels warm to the touch at midday because the fire inside has been burning since dawn is still releasing that stored warmth at 3 in the morning, when the fire has been banked down to coals and the household is asleep. Picture the stone wall, 14 inches thick, its inner face rough plastered with lime mortar. Run your hand along it on a January evening and you feel something unexpected, not cold, but warmth. Not the sharp warmth of a fire, but a deep, residual, steady warmth. The stone does not conduct heat quickly. That is precisely what makes it valuable. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. The wall is a thermal battery, charged each day by the fire, discharged slowly through the night. In Yorkshire and the northern counties, sandstone was more common than limestone, quarried from the same moors that the farmhouses looked out upon. Sandstone has similar thermal properties, though it is somewhat softer and more prone to weathering at its exposed outer face. The builders in those regions compensated by making their walls even thicker, sometimes 16 or 18 inches. These were not architectural decisions made from an engineering manual. They were accumulated wisdom, passed from father to son, from master mason to apprentice, refined over centuries of cold winters and practical experience. In the south and east of England, where good building stone was less readily available, timber frame construction predominated. These houses, the black and white buildings, still standing in Shropshire, Herefordshire, and across East Anglia, used a skeleton of oak or elm posts and beams, with the spaces between filled by a technique called wattle and daub. Wattle was a woven lattice of hazel or willow rods, fitted between the timber uprights. Daub was the material applied over it, a mixture of clay, straw, animal dung, and sometimes lime, applied wet and left to dry and harden into a solid panel. The finished wall was typically 3 to 4 inches thick, considerably less thermal mass than stone, but with its own form of insulation, the trapped air within the clay mixture and the straw fibers running through it, both acting to slow the transfer of heat from inside to outside. Imagine standing inside a timber frame house on a cold morning and placing your hand against the interior face of a daub panel. It feels different from stone, lighter, drier, with a slight give. The surface is uneven, marked by the impressions of the straw mixed into it. It is warmer to the touch than the stone wall in a neighbouring county, because the daub conducts heat less readily than limestone. But it also stores less heat. The thermal battery is smaller. These houses relied more heavily on continuous fire management and less on the walls themselves to maintain temperature through the night. The temperature differential these walls achieved was significant. On a January morning in 1720, when the outside temperature in the English Midlands might fall to 25 or 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 to 7 degrees below freezing, the interior of a well-managed stone farmhouse kitchen could be held at 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a difference of 15 to 20 degrees, achieved entirely by the combination of thick walls, small windows, a managed fire, and the accumulated body heat of the household. It does not sound warm by modern standards, but it was survivable. It was enough. The layout of rooms within a pre-modern farmhouse was itself a strategy for warmth. Picture the kitchen, the heart of the house, not merely the place where food was prepared, but the single heated room around which all winter life organized itself. The kitchen was where the family ate, worked, gathered, and sometimes slept. It was the warmest room because it was the only room with a fire burning continuously. Every other room in the house, the parlour, the sleeping chambers, the storage rooms, was unheated. This concentration of warmth in a single room was not poverty or primitive thinking. It was rational resource management. Heating one room to a survivable temperature requires far less fuel than attempting to heat an entire house. A kitchen measuring 12 feet by 14 feet with an 8-foot ceiling contains approximately 1,344 cubic feet of air. Heating that volume to a comfortable temperature, even with an inefficient open fire, is manageable. Attempting to heat 3 or 4 such rooms simultaneously would require 3 or 4 times the fuel quantities that most ordinary households simply could not afford or obtain. Imagine the family gathered in this single warm space through the long January evening. The fire burns in the hearth. The cook has finished washing the supper vessels and set them to drain on the shelf. The father works at mending a piece of harness leather, his chair pulled close to the warmth. The children sit on the settle, a long wooden bench positioned near the fire. The grandmother, older and less tolerant of cold, has the chair closest to the hearth, her feet on a small wooden footstool to keep them off the cold stone floor. Outside, the temperature continues to fall. Inside this room, in this 12 by 14-foot space, it is warm enough. Small rooms were a thermal advantage, not a deprivation. The standard farmhouse kitchen of 1720 measured between 100 and 144 square feet, smaller than many modern bathrooms. The ceiling height of 7 to 8 feet, compared to the 8 to 10 feet common in modern construction, further reduced the volume of air requiring warmth. Heat rises. A lower ceiling means that the warm air, before it escapes toward the ceiling and begins to cool, lingers closer to the occupants seated or standing at floor level. An 8-foot ceiling in a room with an open fire produces a horizontal band of relatively warm air at the level of human habitation. Raise that ceiling to 10 feet, and much of that warmth drifts upward into a zone above human heads, contributing nothing to the comfort of the people below. The sleeping chambers above the kitchen occupied a similar footprint, but received no direct heat from a fire. They were, in modern terms, unheated rooms. In winter, they were cold, sometimes very cold, but they benefited from two sources of warmth. The first was the heat that rose through the wooden floorboards from the kitchen below. Wooden floors, unlike stone flags, allow air movement between levels. A kitchen fire burning steadily below means that the bedroom floor above it is never as cold as the outside air. The second source was the chimney stack itself, which ran up through the center of the house and remained warm from the kitchen fire. A sleeping chamber whose wall shared brickwork or stone with a chimney stack was measurably warmer than one on an exterior wall. Picture the sleeping chamber on an upper floor of the farmhouse, its single small window looking out on a dark January night. The room is cold, perhaps 38 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit, well below what modern people would find tolerable. But the floorboards are not icy underfoot. There is a faint warmth rising from below. The bed, when it has been properly prepared, will be warm. The cold of the room is temporary, the crossing from the warm kitchen to the warm bed, a matter of minutes, brisk and deliberate but manageable. The windows of a pre-modern farmhouse were small by design and by necessity. A window is a weak point in the building envelope, an interruption in the insulating wall through which heat escapes readily. The builders of 1720 knew this from experience. Their windows measured typically 18 inches wide by 24 inches tall. Some were smaller, very few were larger. The purpose of a window was to admit daylight and air when needed, not to provide a view. In winter, the shutters were closed at dusk and remained closed until dawn, eliminating even the modest heat loss through the glass or cloth covering. Glass windows were a luxury in the farmhouses of 1650. By 1720, glass was more commonly available, but it remained expensive. A single pane of crown glass, the round, slightly distorted glass blown from a gather of molten material and spun flat, measured, perhaps 12 inches by 10 inches. A window of modest size required 4 to 6 such panes, set in lead came and fitted into a wooden frame. For households that could not afford glass, the alternatives were practical, if less elegant. Sheets of oiled linen stretched across the window, opening admitted light while blocking much of the wind. Scraped and flattened ox horn, cut into thin translucent sheets, served similarly. Paper treated with linseed oil was used in some regions. The window tax of 1696, which remained in force until 1851, added a further economic incentive to keep windows small and few. Households with more than 6 windows paid an additional tax on each window above that number. The result was that many houses, even those that could afford glass, bricked up windows or never cut new ones, prioritizing economy over light. This government-imposed measure, intended as a revenue source, inadvertently reinforced the thermal logic of small, few windows that pre-modern builders had already established by instinct and experience. Imagine closing the heavy wooden shutters of the farmhouse as the evening light fails. The shutters are internal, swinging on iron pintles set into the stone reveals of the window opening. They are solid oak, 1.5 inches thick. When they close, the window opening is sealed. The sound changes, the low whistle of wind that has been audible through the afternoon drops away. The room feels immediately slightly warmer, or at least less drafty. The shutters are then secured with a wooden bar or an iron hook and eye catch. The window, for all practical purposes, ceases to exist until morning. The doors of a well-built farmhouse were substantial. The front door, often the only door in a small farmhouse, was oak or elm, 2 to 3 inches thick, hung on strap hinges of wrought iron. The weight of such a door was considerable. A solid oak door 2 feet wide, 6 feet 6 inches tall, and 2.5 inches thick, weighs approximately 60 to 70 pounds. That weight was a thermal asset. A thick, dense door resists the passage of heat more effectively than a thin one. But doors, however thick, have gaps. The gap beneath a door was the primary entry point for cold air, the draft that chilled the ankles of anyone seated in a wooden chair on a stone floor. The solution was the draft excluder, a long cylinder of cloth stuffed tightly with straw, wool scraps, or dried moss, laid against the base of the door on the interior side. Some households sewed these from old garments, others wove them from rushes. The principle was identical across all variations. Block the cold air at its entry point before it spreads across the floor. Wealthier households employed a vestibule system, 2 doors separated by a small enclosed space of 2 or 3 feet. A visitor entering the house passed through the outer door, which then closed behind them before they opened the inner door. This airlock arrangement prevented cold outside air from entering the main living space directly. In simpler farmhouses, a heavy curtain of thick wool or old canvas hung on a wooden rod just inside the door served a similar function. When the door opened, the curtain swallowed the blast of cold air. When the door closed again, the curtain fell back into place. The warm air of the kitchen was preserved. Picture the heavy oak door of the farmhouse, its surface rough with age and weather, the iron strap hinges darkened and worn. Imagine stepping through it on a January evening, the cold outside air sharp against the face, and then closing it firmly behind you. The curtain settles. The fire is visible across the kitchen. The warmth reaches you before you have taken 3 steps. The floors of pre-modern farmhouses varied with the wealth of the household and the region of England. In the humblest dwellings, the floor was packed earth clay mixed with ox blood, which acted as a hardening and waterproofing agent, then tamped down repeatedly until it was as solid as soft stone. Such floors were swept clean but never truly warm. The earth beneath drew heat from any bare foot placed upon it. A person sitting in a chair on an earth floor, even close to the fire, felt the cold rising through the soles of their shoes or boots. Rush matting addressed this problem partially. Rushes, the tall aquatic plants that grew along the margins of rivers and streams throughout England, were cut in late summer, dried, and woven, or simply laid in thick bundles across the floor. A good rush, mat 1.5 inches thick, provided a modest but meaningful barrier between the cold earth and the feet above it. The matting was replaced. Each autumn, the old rushes swept out and burned, fresh matting laid before the cold weather settled in. By 1720, flagstone floors were increasingly common in better farmhouses. Large flat pieces of sandstone or limestone set closely together on a prepared bed of compacted rubble. Flagstone floors were easier to keep clean than earth, more resistant to moisture, and more durable under heavy use. They were also colder. Stone conducts heat away from anything resting on it more efficiently than earth, and far more efficiently than wood. A flagstone floor in an unheated corridor or entry passage could feel brutally cold underfoot on a winter morning. Picture the stone-flagged floor of the farmhouse kitchen, its surface worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, its colour varying from grey to warm amber depending on the local stone. The flags are cold away from the fire, cold enough that the children have been told not to sit on them. Near the hearth, the stone is warm to the touch, heated by the fire's radiated heat. A rag rug, strips of old cloth braided together and coiled into a rough oval, lies between the fire and the table, its textile construction providing insulation that the flagstone alone cannot. Upper floors in farmhouses were almost always wooden wide planks of oak or elm laid across the floor joists. Wood is a far better insulator than stone. It does not feel cold underfoot in the way that flagstone does. It allows some passage of warm air from the rooms below through the gaps between boards, not a draft exactly, but a slow movement of warmth upward. These wooden floors represented the boundary between the warm inhabited space of the kitchen and the cold sleeping spaces above. The roof of the farmhouse, in 1720, was most likely thatched. Thatch bundles of wheat straw, water reed, or rye straw, tied in overlapping layers over a framework of rafters and laths, was the dominant roofing material across rural England until the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It was not simply tradition. Thatch is an extraordinarily effective insulating material. A good thatch roof, 12 to 18 inches thick from the base of the first layer to the exposed ridge, has an insulating value roughly equivalent to modern fiberglass insulation at the same thickness. A 12-inch thatch has an R value of approximately 36. An 18-inch thatch reaches 54 or higher. The bundles of straw trap air between the stems, and trapped air is the fundamental mechanism of insulation. Heat cannot move efficiently through still air. It moves by conduction through solid materials and by convection through moving air. A thick layer of still air, whether trapped in a woolen fibre, between wall stones, or within the stalks of a thatch, is resistant to heat transfer. The roof that kept rain from entering the house in summer was keeping warmth from escaping the house in winter. The function was dual and complementary. Thatch required maintenance and replacement. A wheat straw thatch lasted 25 to 40 years before it became too degraded at the surface to shed water effectively. Water reed, used more commonly in the eastern counties, where it grew along the margins of the Norfolk Broads and similar wetlands, could last 50 years or more. The thatching trade, highly skilled and regionally specialised, was constant work because every village had thatched roofs requiring attention. Slate and tile roofing, more common in the later part of our period, and particularly in areas with easy access to quarried slate North Wales, the Lake District. Cornwall offered very different thermal properties. Slate has an R value approaching 0 per inch. A slate roof is essentially thermally transparent. It provides no meaningful insulation at all. What it provides is durability, fire resistance, and impermeability to water. Houses with slate roofs relied more heavily on other aspects of their construction to retain heat. The stone walls did heavier work. The windows were smaller. The fires burned more continuously. Picture the thick thatch roof of the farmhouse as seen from the lane, its amber-grey surface ridged at the peak where the final layer of straw has been combed and pinned into place. In winter, after a snowfall, the thatch holds the snow on its surface rather than allowing it to slide off. The snow itself adds another layer of insulation, an accidental but effective one. Beneath it, inside the house, the heat generated by the kitchen fire is held within the building by the combination of thick walls and thick roof, escaping only slowly into the cold January air outside. The chimney was the most visible architectural feature of the farmhouse and one of the most important. Before the widespread adoption of chimneys in ordinary English houses, a process that happened gradually through the 15th and 16th centuries, cooking fires burned on central hearths in the middle of single-roomed halls, and smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or through gaps in the thatch. The interior of such a hall was permanently smoke-filled at ceiling level. The timbers above, blackened by centuries of accumulated soot, the inhabitants breathing air that modern observers would find barely tolerable. The chimney changed this fundamentally. A properly constructed chimney, a vertical flue of stone or brick, beginning at the back of the hearth and rising up through the roof structure to a point 3 or 4 feet above the ridge, created a draft that drew combustion gases up and out of the building. The physics were simple. Warm air rises. A column of warm smoke inside a tall chimney is lighter than the cool air outside. This difference in density creates upward movement, the draft that pulls air across the burning fuel and carries the products of combustion upward and away. A chimney 18 to 24 inches wide at its base, typical for a farmhouse kitchen hearth of 1720, narrowed as it rose, reducing to 12 to 16 inches at the point where it passed through the roof. The height above the roof peak was critical. A chimney that barely clears the roofline is subject to downdrafts, gusts of wind, that push down the flue and drive smoke back into the room. A chimney extending 3 to 4 feet above the ridge of a thatched roof generally cleared this problem, though wind direction and the presence of nearby trees or hills could still cause occasional difficulty. Picture the chimney of the farmhouse, its stone courses projecting from the rooftop, mortar joints still holding firm after decades of exposure. In January, smoke rises steadily from it, not the billowing white cloud of a newly started fire, but the thin, pale, continuous thread of a fire long established and burning well, adding its carbon to the cold air above the village. Chimneys required sweeping. Creosote, the oily, combustible residue of wood smoke, accumulated on the interior walls of the flue at a rate of roughly 1/4 of an inch per month of heavy use. A layer of creosote thick enough to catch fire was the cause of chimney fires, which burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit and could crack the surrounding masonry, spread to the roof timbers, and destroy the house. Chimney sweeping was therefore not optional. Most households had their chimneys swept 2 to 4 times per year, more frequently if they burned green or resinous wood. The sweeps who performed this work were often children. Boys as young as 4 or 5 years old were employed by master sweeps to climb inside the flue, their small bodies suited to the narrow passages that adults could not enter. They scraped the accumulated creosote from the walls with small brushes and their own hands and elbows, working upward in the dark, the soot falling around them. This practice continued well into the 19th century, before legislation gradually restricted and eventually eliminated it. So, the architecture of warmth in a pre-modern English farmhouse was a system, not a single element, but a combination of elements working together. Thick stone walls absorbed and released heat slowly. Small rooms concentrated what heat was available in the spaces actually inhabited. Low ceilings kept warm air within reach of the people below. Small windows minimized heat loss through the building's weakest points. Thick shutters sealed those windows against the night cold. Heavy doors with excluders blocked the draft at ground level. Rush matting or wooden floors provided some insulation underfoot. Thatched roofs held the interior warmth within the building. The chimney carried combustion gases safely away, while creating the draft that made the fire burn well. None of these elements was invented at a specific date by a named individual. They accumulated over centuries of practical experience, builders and occupants, learning by trial and error, by suffering, by observation, what kept a house warmer and what did not. The farmhouse of 1720 was the product of perhaps 500 years of such accumulated wisdom, refined by generations who could not afford to get it wrong. Back at our stone farmhouse in 1720, the fire that burns in the kitchen hearth requires fuel. What burns in that fire, how it was obtained, how it was stored and prepared, these practical matters, meant the difference between warmth and freezing. A household that managed its fuel supply well survived the winter comfortably. One that did not, that burned green wood, that ran short in February, that stored its peat improperly faced cold and hardship. Fuel was not a convenience. It was a survival resource, managed with the same care and attention given to food and water. Wood was the primary fuel across most of England throughout our period. Not all wood was equally valuable. The experienced householder in 1720 understood the differences between fuel types with the precision that a modern engineer might apply to understanding energy densities. Hardwoods, oak, ash, beech were the preferred fuels because they burned slowly, produced intense, sustained heat, and left a useful residue of hot coals that could maintain warmth for hours after the last log was added. Softwoods, pine, fir, willow burned faster and less hotly, producing more smoke and ash relative to the heat generated. Picture the woodpile stacked against the south wall of the farmhouse, sheltered from the worst of the rain by the overhang of the thatch eaves above. The logs are split, and stacked with their cut faces outward, where wind can reach the exposed wood and continue the drying process. Oak and ash predominate. Oak burns at 26 to 28 million BTUs per cord, a cord being a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 8 feet long, containing 128 cubic feet of wood. Ash burns at approximately 24 million BTUs per cord, and has the additional advantage of burning acceptably even when slightly green, not fully seasoned. The farm labourers cutting and stacking this wood knew nothing of BTUs, but they knew, from long experience, that oak logs split in October burned well the following winter, and that green wood hissed and smoked and produced far less warmth than the effort of cutting and carrying it warranted. Seasoning the drying of cut wood over time was essential. A freshly cut oak log contains 50 to 60% water by weight. That water must be driven off before the wood can burn efficiently. Green wood, when placed on a fire, spends much of its combustion energy boiling off the water within its cells, rather than generating room warmth. The result is a fire that produces clouds of white steam and grey smoke, less heat than expected, and a rapid build-up of creosote in the chimney as the low-temperature combustion leaves unburnt compounds coating the flue walls. A seasoned oak log split and stacked in the open for 12 to 24 months contains perhaps 20% water. It catches more readily, burns hotter, produces less smoke, and leaves a better coal bed. The quantities required to heat a farmhouse through an English winter were substantial. A household burning wood as its primary fuel through the cold months from late October through March. 5 months of sustained burning consumed between 4 and 6 cords of hardwood. 4 cords is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet deep, and 32 feet long. 6 cords is the same height and depth, but 48 feet long. This wood had to be cut from trees, transported to the farm, split into manageable pieces, and stacked to dry all before it could be burned. The labour alone was considerable. The right to obtain it was far from guaranteed. Imagine splitting oak logs in the autumn, the work beginning at first light and continuing until the arms tire. The maul, a heavy wooden mallet with an iron face, drives the wedge into the end grain of the log with a sound that carries across the still morning air. Oak splits cleanly with the grain if you find the right angle. It resists and deflects the wedge if you work against the grain. This knowledge where to strike, at what angle, with what force was learned over years of practice and was never written down. The rights to gather and cut wood were governed by a complex system of law, custom, and feudal arrangement that varied considerably from one region of England to another. Gleaning rights, the right to gather fallen branches, dead wood, and scrub from common land, and the margins of private forests were recognised in many areas but contested in others. Strict forest laws dating to the medieval period imposed severe penalties for unauthorised cutting of living trees on royal or private land. A man caught cutting a standing tree on another's land could face transportation or worse in the harsher periods of the 17th and 18th centuries. Common rights, the right of tenants and freeholders to use common land for fuel gathering, were legally established in many villages, but increasingly challenged as enclosure movements consolidated land into private ownership. The enclosure of common land that proceeded through the 18th century was not only a disruption of grazing rights, it also removed the fuel gathering rights that many ordinary families depended upon, forcing them to purchase wood or coal that they had previously gathered freely. Picture selecting a log from the stack beside the farmhouse hearth, a log split 18 months ago. Its cut face pale and dry, its bark loose and papery. It is lighter than it looks, because most of the water has long since evaporated. It is ready. You carry it inside and set it among the burning coals with the care of someone who understands that each log is a measured quantity of warmth and cannot be replaced without effort. In the north and west of England, Yorkshire, Cumbria, Lancashire, the moorlands of Northumberland, and across into Scotland and Ireland, peat was a fuel of equal or greater importance to wood. Peat is not precisely a fuel that is gathered so much as one that is mined, slowly and carefully, from the surface of bogs and moorlands, where it has accumulated over centuries. A bog that is a metre deep contains compressed plant matter, primarily sphagnum moss, that began accumulating roughly 1,000 years ago, at a rate of approximately 1 millimetre of depth per year. Peat cutting was seasonal work, performed in late spring and early summer when the weather was dry enough to allow the cut peat to begin drying. The cutter used a long-bladed spade called a turf spade or slane, the blade angled to cut and lift a rectangular block of peat approximately 12 inches long, 4 inches wide, and 3 inches deep in a single motion. The blocks were laid out on the surface of the surrounding bog or on nearby grass to begin drying. After several weeks, when the outer surface had hardened and dried, they were turned and restacked in small structures called stooks, leaning arrangements that allowed air to circulate around each block. After 8 to 12 weeks of good drying weather, the peat was ready to be brought home. Picture the peat stack, dark and earthy, built against the gable end of a farmhouse in the north of England, a wall of brown-black blocks stacked 5 feet high, and as long as the household's winter requirements demanded. A family of 5 or 6 in northern England needed 50 to 80 barrow loads of peat to see through the winter. The stack smells of the earth. It came from a deep, organic, slightly sour smell, the compressed centuries of a bog compressed further into portable blocks of solid fuel. Peat burns differently from wood. It catches slowly, requiring more kindling and a longer establishment period before it sustains itself. Once burning, it produces a slow, steady, relatively low-temperature heat, more even than wood, less dramatic, producing a distinctive sweet smoky smell that anyone who has experienced it remembers. A peat fire maintained through the night held its heat well. The characteristic smell of a peat fire lingers in the walls and furniture of a house long after the fire itself has been extinguished. The reason that old farmhouses in Ireland and Scotland still carry that smell in their stone and foul plaster. Imagine the distinctive smell of burning peat drifting from a farmhouse chimney on a winter evening, a smell quite unlike wood smoke, sweeter and more complex, carrying the scent of the bog itself. It was the smell of warmth across large parts of northern England, Scotland, and Ireland for centuries. Coal was available in England from very early in our period, but its use in ordinary farmhouses was geographically and economically constrained. The major coalfields of England in Northumberland, County Durham, Yorkshire, and the Midlands had been worked since the medieval period, and by 1700, the Newcastle coalfield alone was producing approximately 1 million tonnes of coal per year. Most of this coal was shipped by sea to London and other coastal cities, where it was known as sea coal to distinguish it from pit coal brought overland. The economics of coal consumption in 1720 were straightforward. Coal was affordable near the mines and near the ports that received the coastal deliveries. It became progressively more expensive as you moved inland and away from navigable water, because transportation by cart over unpaved roads added significant cost per mile. In London, a ton of coal cost 25 to 30 shillings in the 1750s, expensive but accessible for a city household. In an inland Midlands village 20 miles from the nearest navigable river, the same ton of coal might cost 40 shillings or more after cartage, pricing it beyond the reach of ordinary labouring families. The coal fire required different equipment and technique from the wood fire. Wood burns best on a flat hearth or on andirons, the iron bars that hold the logs slightly above the hearth floor, allowing air to circulate beneath them. Coal burns best in a grate, an iron basket that holds the fuel in a contained pile and allows air to enter from below through gaps between the bars. The higher temperatures achievable in a coal grate and the different combustion chemistry of coal compared to wood produced a different quality of heat more intense in a localized area, but also producing more sulfurous smoke and, in enclosed rooms, greater problems with air quality. Picture the coal delivered by cart to a farmhouse on the edge of a Yorkshire mining town, shoveled from the cart bed into a stone bunker built into the base of the exterior wall beside the kitchen door. The coal is black and lustrous, varying in size from fist-sized lumps to smaller chips and slack. It is heavier than it looks. A ton of coal occupies roughly 40 cubic feet, compared to 128 cubic feet for a cord of wood. The heating value is similar per unit of heat delivered. Good coal produces 25 to 28 million BTUs per ton, but its density makes it easier to store in quantity. Imagine the sulfurous edge to the smoke from a coal fire, not unpleasant exactly, but distinctly different from the cleaner smell of burning wood. In London by 1720, the combination of hundreds of thousands of coal fires burning simultaneously had begun to produce the chronic air quality problems that would worsen through the 18th and 19th centuries. Outside the cities, a single coal fire in a farmhouse kitchen was simply a warmth source with a distinctive smell. Inside the cities, it was part of something larger and more troubling. Where wood was scarce or expensive and peat was not available, rural households used whatever combustible material they could obtain. Agricultural waste, the straw left after threshing wheat, the dried stalks of corn plants, the woody stems of bean plants after harvest, was used as kindling and as a supplement to better fuels. Straw burns fast and hot but briefly, producing relatively little sustained warmth and considerable ash. It was useful for starting fires and for quick bursts of heat when food needed to be cooked rapidly, but it could not sustain a fire through a cold night. Gorse and furze, the tough, thorny scrub plants that colonised heathland, common land, and the edges of moorland across Britain burned hot and fast. They were gathered in great bundles and stored dry. A bundle of dried gorse about a foot in diameter and 3 feet long would burn fiercely for 15 to 20 minutes, producing intense heat but no lasting coal bed. Gorse was valuable for heating ovens. The short, fierce burst of heat was ideal for bringing a bread oven to baking temperature, but not for sustained space heating. Picture gathering gorse from the heath in November. The cut bundles stacked on a handcart, the prickly stems scratching through thick woolen gloves. The gorse is already partly dried by autumn wind, its bright yellow flowers long gone, the stems stiff and well combustible. 10 loads of gorse from an afternoon's gathering would fill the woodshed's auxiliary corner and supply kindling and oven heating fuel for 6 weeks. Dried cattle dung, known in some areas as dung cakes, was used in the treeless regions of the Scottish Highlands and in parts of Ireland where neither wood nor peat was readily available. The dung was collected from the byres during winter, mixed with straw for structural cohesion, shaped into flat cakes, and dried in summer sun. The resulting fuel had a heat value of only 6 to 8 million BTUs per ton, equivalent very low, and burned with a dense, acrid smoke. But it was free, available in quantity wherever cattle were kept, and required no tools or skills to produce beyond labour. In areas where the alternatives were burning furniture or freezing, dung cakes were warmth. The storage of fuel was as important as its procurement. Wet wood burns poorly. Wet peat barely burns at all. Wet coal that has absorbed moisture, sitting in an open bunker through winter rain, burns less efficiently than dry coal. Every fuel type required protection from the English weather, which delivered precipitation in some form approximately half the days of winter. The woodshed was a standard outbuilding on any farmhouse that could afford to build one, a structure with solid walls on 3 sides, open or partially open on the 4th, with a roof that kept rain off the stacked wood within. The open or partially open side allowed wind to continue the drying process, which never truly stops. Even wood that has been seasoned for 2 years benefits from continued air circulation. The woodshed roof was typically a simple lean-to, its lower edge fixed to the wall of the main house or barn, its upper edge against a slightly higher wall or supported by posts. It did not need to be fine. It needed to keep the rain off. Picture the woodshed, its roof keeping logs dry through January rains, the interior fragrant with the dry, faintly vanilla smell of aged oak. A supply of 2 to 3 days' worth of wood is kept inside by the kitchen hearth, in a log box, or simply stacked in the corner close enough for easy access during the night, dry enough to catch quickly when needed. The main stock remains in the shed, drawn on daily. A household that managed its fuel well entered winter with its woodshed full, its peat stack complete, its coal bunker stocked as far as funds allowed. It then drew on these reserves steadily through the months of cold, managing consumption against the slowly diminishing supply. Running short of fuel in January or February when the coldest weather was most likely, and when procurement was most difficult, was a serious problem. The anxiety about fuel supply ran through the consciousness of pre-modern households in a way that modern people, who pay a gas or electricity bill without thinking much about the physical fuel supply, no longer experience. The labor of fuel preparation was continuous through the autumn and into early winter. Cutting wood, splitting it, carting it, stacking it, cutting peat, turning it, stacking it, carting it home, and restacking it. The family's children played a role here, gathering kindling small twigs, thin sticks, dry leaves, was work within the capacity of children as young as 5 or 6. Kindling was essential to fire management. Without it, starting a fire from cold was slow and difficult. With a good supply of dry kindling, a basket of it sitting by the hearth, the morning revival of the banked fire could be accomplished in 10 minutes rather than 30. Imagine the autumn work of cutting and stacking firewood, the smell of split wood sharp in the cool air, the sound of the maul striking wedge carrying across the farmyard. This was not work done reluctantly. It was survival work, understood as such. A household that finished its fuel preparation before the first hard frost of November entered winter with the particular satisfaction of being ready. A household that had not was anxious. Picture the fuel store at its fullest late October, just before the cold settles in properly, the woodshed packed to the rafters with split and seasoned oak and ash, the peat stack complete, the coal bunker stocked. This is the household's winter capital, accumulated through months of labor to be drawn on steadily through the months ahead. Each log taken from the stack is a unit of warmth already paid for in sweat and time. Each log burned is warmth delivered. The accounting is simple, physical, and direct in a way that a gas bill or an electricity meter reading is not. Imagine carrying armfuls of wood from the shed to the kitchen on a January morning, the bite of cold air as the door opens, the logs rough and faintly damp on their outer surfaces from overnight frost, the weight of them real in the arms. This small daily labor, repeated every morning through 4 or 5 months, was not resented. It was simply the cost of warmth paid in the most direct possible currency, the body's own effort. The rights and laws governing fuel were a constant backdrop to this practical reality. Forest laws protected private and royal woodland from unauthorized cutting. Common rights provided some households with access to fuel on common land, but those rights were increasingly contested through our period. The enclosure movements of the 18th century were experienced partly as a fuel crisis by the households that lost common rights they had depended upon. When the common was enclosed and the right to gather dead wood from its margins extinguished, those families had to purchase fuel that had previously been free. That shift from subsistence gathering to market purchase was a significant change in the economics of household survival. In our Midlands farmhouse that January morning, the fire in the kitchen hearth is already burning. It did not go out overnight. It has burned continuously for weeks, perhaps months. Managing this fire, keeping it alive, controlling its heat, ensuring it neither dies nor consumes fuel wastefully, is skilled work. It is work that the householder has performed every day for decades, that her mother performed before her, that her grandmother performed before that. It is work so deeply embedded in daily life that it requires no conscious thought in its execution, only habit and attention and the particular knowledge that comes from long practice. The continuous fire was a defining feature of pre-modern household life. In most English farmhouses, from October through April, 6 months of the year, the kitchen fire was never allowed to go completely out. Not because it was impossible to relight from scratch, but because letting the fire die was wasteful, inconvenient, and carried an almost moral weight. A household whose fire went out was, by the standards of the time, a household that had failed to manage itself properly. The fire was not just warmth, it was the center of domestic life, the place where food was cooked, where water was heated, where light was supplemented in the hours before dawn and after dusk. Its continuous burning was a mark of a functioning household. Picture the evening banking ritual, the last task before the household went to bed. The fire has burned all day. By 9 or 10 o'clock, the fuel consumption has been deliberately reduced, the logs allowed to burn down to a deep bed of glowing coals. The householder takes the long-handled poker and rakes the coals into a compact pile at the center of the hearth, not spread out, but mounded, concentrating what remains. A shovelful of ash, cool grey ash gathered from the edges of the hearth, is spread evenly over the coal pile, 2 to 3 inches deep. This ash layer acts as a blanket, slowing the rate of combustion dramatically by limiting the oxygen reaching the coals beneath. In some households, particularly in Ireland and parts of northern England where peat was the primary fuel, a layer of wet peat turves was laid over the mounded coals as an additional smothering agent. The wet peat did not catch fire. It simply sat there, gradually drying through the night, its moisture content ensuring that it conducted heat away from the coals rather than sustaining combustion. By morning, the peat layer would be partially dried, the coal beneath it still glowing, ready to receive the morning's attention. The banked fire consumed fuel at roughly 1/4 of its normal rate. A fire burning freely requires continuous oxygen and fuel to sustain it. A banked fire, with its oxygen supply throttled by ash and perhaps peat, simply smoulders, sustaining itself at the lowest possible combustion rate, preserving the coals for morning without consuming significant quantities of the household's fuel supply. Imagine uncovering the coals at dawn, a January dawn when the bedroom has been cold through the night, and the kitchen, even with its thick walls, has cooled from the warmth of the previous evening to a temperature that makes breath visible. The householder, dressed quickly in the cold dark, comes downstairs to the hearth. The ash layer is still in place. She takes the poker and carefully scrapes it to the sides of the hearth, revealing the coal bed beneath. If the banking was done well, the coals are still glowing dull red in the dimness, but alive. She crouches close and blows gently across the surface, and the coals brighten. They are alive. The fire survived the night. Picture the relief when the coals are still alive, small but real, the particular satisfaction of a skill applied correctly and validated by result. The householder adds a handful of fine kindling to the glowing coals, dry twigs, a few split sticks of pine or ash, perhaps a twist of dried straw. Within minutes, small flames appear. She adds larger pieces of kindling, then a small log, then progressively larger logs as the fire establishes itself. Within 15 minutes, the kitchen fire is burning freely, radiating heat into the room, and the day has begun on solid footing. On the occasions when the banking failed, when the coals had gone completely cold overnight, the fire truly dead, relighting it was the task of the tinderbox. Matches did not exist in 1720. The friction match, the kind that lights with a stroke against a rough surface, was not developed until the 1830s and did not become widely affordable until the 1850s. For the householder in 1720, Producing fire from scratch required flint, steel, and tinder. Picture the tinderbox by the hearth, a small tin or wooden box with a close-fitting lid, containing three items: a piece of good flint, a C-shaped or oval piece of hard steel known as the fire steel or striker, and a supply of tinder. The tinder was the most important and most perishable element. Charcloth was the preferred tinder, pieces of linen or cotton, charred in a closed tin over a fire until they turned black and carbonized without quite burning. A spark landing on charcloth would smolder immediately, holding a tiny point of fire within the fabric. The process of starting fire with flint and steel sounds slow and difficult, and for the unskilled it was. But for a person who had done it daily since childhood, it was a matter of perhaps 2 minutes in dry conditions. The flint was held in one hand, the fire steel in the other, the tinder resting on a flat surface or in the lid of the box. A sharp, glancing strike of the steel across the flint's sharp edge sent a shower of sparks, tiny particles of steel ignited by friction, onto the waiting tinder. One spark, landing correctly, caused the charcloth to smolder at a single point. A tiny orange glow, barely visible in daylight, impossible to miss in dimness. The smouldering cloth was then lifted and folded around a small nest of fine, dry material, the inner fibers of dried grass, the shredded bark of certain trees, dried moss, and blown gently until the smoulder grew into a small flame. That flame was used to light a candle or a spill of twisted paper, which was then carried to the hearth to light the kindling. Imagine striking flint on steel in the cold dimness of a winter morning, the arc of sparks, the watching for that single point of orange glow in the charcloth, the careful cupping of the hands to protect the delicate smoulder from any breath of draught. The skill was in the striking angle, the quality of the flint edge, the dryness of the tinder. In damp weather, when the tinder had absorbed moisture from the air, starting fire could take 10 to 20 attempts, the striker's hands growing sore. On a dry, cold morning, a skilled person could produce fire reliably in 2 to 3 strikes. The hearth itself was a designed space, not merely a hole in the wall. The fireplace opening of a kitchen hearth in 1720 typically measured 4 feet wide by 3 feet tall, large enough to accommodate cooking pots, roasting equipment, and the long logs that were the primary fuel. The hearthstone, a large flat piece of fire-resistant stone, typically sandstone or granite, extending from the base of the fireplace, opening out into the room by 18 to 24 inches, protected the wooden floor from fallen sparks and rolling coals. At the back of the fireplace, against the rear wall, the fireback was sometimes installed a cast-iron plate, roughly 18 to 24 inches tall, with a decorative surface pressed with heraldic or geometric designs. The fireback served a functional purpose. Cast iron absorbs heat from the fire and radiates it into the room more efficiently than the stone or brick of the chimney back behind it. A fireback glowing red-hot at the height of an afternoon fire was making a measurable contribution to the warmth of the room. The andirons, sometimes called fire dogs, were 2 horizontal iron bars, mounted on short legs, spaced approximately 18 inches apart, running front to back across the width of the hearth. Logs were laid across these bars rather than directly on the hearth floor. This elevation allowed air to circulate beneath the burning fuel, feeding oxygen to the base of the fire where it was most needed. A log lying flat on a stone hearth floor tends to smother its own base, burning poorly from below. A log elevated on andirons burns from all sides simultaneously, more efficiently, and more hotly. Picture the cast-iron fireback at the rear of the hearth, its surface engraved with a simple vine pattern, blackened by years of fire to a deep charcoal grey. The heat it radiates is palpable at a distance of several feet, a steady, even warmth quite different from the flickering directional heat of the flames themselves. From the chimney, a chimney crane, a wrought iron arm pivoting on a vertical pin set into the chimney, jam swung in and out over the fire. This arm bore hooks at varying heights, from which pots, kettles, and cauldrons could be suspended over the heat at whatever distance from the flames gave the desired cooking temperature. A pot hook or adjustable ratchet device called a trammel allowed the cook to raise or lower the pot without moving it entirely off the fire, providing a crude but effective form of temperature control. The cook knew from experience that a pot hung at 12 inches above the coals simmered steadily. The same pot at 6 inches above the coals boiled hard. The knowledge was entirely practical and entirely reliable. Imagine the chimney crane swinging slowly as a heavy iron pot is adjusted for position, the heat of the fire rising around the arm, the cook's face flushed with warmth as she reaches in to adjust the trammel hook. This was daily work, the management of heat for cooking purposes, that was simultaneously the management of heat for room warmth. The kitchen fire was never a single-purpose thing. It cooked breakfast, heated water for washing, dried wet clothing hung on the rack above, warmed the room, and maintained the coal bed that would be banked for the night. The control of heat output from an open fire was a matter of fuel feeding, airflow management, and the deliberate positioning of logs. Adding fuel increased heat output, allowing the fire to burn down to coals reduced it. The size and arrangement of the fuel mattered. A single large log burning slowly produced steady, even heat. Several smaller pieces burning simultaneously produced higher heat but consumed fuel faster. A cook who needed a fierce heat for boiling might add several sticks at once and give the fire time to establish itself before putting the pot on. A cook who needed a sustained moderate heat for simmering would place one medium log at a time and allow each to burn down before adding the next. The temperature zones around an open fire were understood intuitively by anyone who had spent a winter beside one. Directly in front of the fire and close to it within 2 or 3 feet, the radiated heat was intense, strong enough to make the face uncomfortably warm while the back remained cold. This was the paradox of the open fire. It heated one side of a person while the other side remained exposed to the room air. The phrase roasting on one side and freezing on the other was not simply a figure of speech. It was an accurate description of the experience of sitting close to a pre-modern hearth. At the center of the fire itself, temperatures reached 500 to 700 degrees Fahrenheit at the surface of the burning logs. At the edges of the hearth, where the andirons ended and the hearthstone extended beyond the fire, temperatures dropped to 200 to 300 degrees, hot enough to warm a stone or a brick placed there, but not hot enough for cooking. Pots placed at the very edge of the hearthstone could be kept warm without cooking further. This graduated temperature zone from very hot at the center to merely warm at the edges gave the experienced cook a primitive but functional range of heat conditions to work with. Smoke management was a constant challenge. Even with a well-designed chimney, some smoke re-entered the room under certain wind conditions when the wind came from a particular direction, when a neighboring tree intercepted the airflow, when the chimney had partially blocked with creosote. The signs were familiar. The room grew hazy. Eyes began to water. The smell of smoke became heavy. The immediate response was to open a window or door slightly, increasing air movement through the room, and to add a small amount of fresh fuel to increase the fire's heat and therefore its draw up the chimney. Picture smoke rising through the chimney on a still January morning, thin, pale, continuous, the sign of a fire burning well and drawing cleanly. Imagine the contrast with a downwind day when the smoke drifts back into the kitchen, the haze building slowly at ceiling level, the necessity of opening the door despite the cold to let the air move and carry the smoke out. The single kitchen fire served every purpose that heat served in the household. Cooking was the most obvious. The hanging pots, the roasting on a spit, the bread baked in the Dutch oven. A Dutch oven was a heavy cast iron pot with legs approximately 3 inches tall, the legs allowing it to stand on the hearthstone, and a concave lid with a rim around its edge. Food was placed inside the pot. Coals were shoveled from the fire onto the hearth and arranged beneath the pot to heat it from below. Additional coals were placed on the concave lid, held in place by the rim, to heat the food from above. The result was a form of enclosed heat, an approximation of oven baking, achievable entirely from the coals of the kitchen fire. Bread, puddings, small roasts, and pies could all be cooked in the Dutch oven, with results that a modern cook would recognize as proper baking. The reflector oven was another device that used the kitchen fire for baking without requiring a separate oven structure. It was a tin box, open on the side facing the fire, with a shiny interior surface that reflected the fire's radiated heat onto the food inside. A joint of meat placed in a reflector oven and set before the fire roasted in the reflected heat, the interior of the tin becoming as hot as a moderate oven, while the exterior of the device remained cool enough to touch. The tin's reflectivity was the key. A dull or blackened interior would absorb rather than reflect the heat. Imagine bread baking in the Dutch oven, the coals heaped both beneath and upon it, the kitchen filling with the smell of baking that blended with the wood smoke and the morning porridge on the chimney crane overhead. This was the smell of a functioning household, a warm household, a household managing its fire and its food and its warmth, all from a single hearth. Fire safety was a constant concern. A fire burning continuously in an open hearth in a timber-framed house was a permanent threat to that house. Sparks ejected from the burning fuel, particularly from green or resinous wood, could travel several feet before landing on a wooden floor, a rush mat, a garment laid too close for warmth, a child sitting on the settle. The hearthstone extended beyond the fire, opening precisely to catch these sparks before they reached combustible flooring. A fire screen, a frame of woven metal or heavy fabric, was sometimes placed in front of the hearth when the fire was unattended, to catch sparks and prevent rolled coals from escaping onto the floor. A bucket of water or a box of sand kept near the hearth was standard household precaution. Small fires, a burning rush mat, a smouldering piece of fallen fabric could be doused or smothered immediately. Large fires, a chimney fire, a burning thatch were beyond the capacity of a bucket and required the entire household's effort, plus the help of neighbours. Chimney fires were among the most terrifying household emergencies. A chimney fire occurred when the accumulated creosote on the chimney walls reached sufficient temperature to ignite, typically from a particularly hot fire or a change in draft conditions. When creosote caught, it burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The chimney became a vertical tube of white-hot fire. The heat was sufficient to crack the surrounding masonry, potentially exposing the adjacent timber framing of the house to temperatures that ignited it. Chimney fires that spread to the structure destroyed houses. The sound of a chimney fire, a deep, rushing roar audible from outside, accompanied by showers of burning creosote particles ejected from the chimney top, was a sound that every person of the period knew meant trouble. Picture the fire screen protecting the hearth from sparks, a simple frame of iron wire mesh, freestanding, positioned before the fire when the household is occupied elsewhere. It is not a permanent solution. It requires setting and moving each time the fire needs attention. But for the half hour when everyone is in the parlour or upstairs, it is the difference between a safe fire and an accident. Beyond the hearth itself, several specialized devices extended the fire's warmth to specific situations. The bed warming pan, a shallow copper dish, roughly 10 to 12 inches in diameter, mounted on a handle 3 feet long, was used to pre-warm the sheets before bed. The procedure was straightforward. A shovelful of hot coals from the hearth was placed inside the pan, which was then closed with its perforated lid. The pan was carried to the bedroom, slipped between the upper and lower sheets, and moved slowly back and forth across the entire surface of the bed, spending approximately 5 to 8 minutes in each section foot area, middle, top. The coal inside radiated heat through the perforated lid, warming the linen above and below. Done carefully, a bed warming pan raised the temperature of a cold bed's interior from the room temperature of perhaps 38 degrees to a comfortable 55 or 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Done carelessly left in one spot too long, it scorched the linen. The copper bowl itself grew very hot. Imagine sliding the bed warmer between cold sheets on a January night. The hiss as the residual moisture in the linen contacts the warm copper, the gradual spreading warmth following the pan's path across the bed. The sheets, when the pan has been removed, are warm to the touch. Not the fierce warmth of a heated room, but the gentle, enclosing warmth of pre-warmed linen warmth that the body's own heat will sustain and extend through the night. Warming stones were a simpler and lower-cost alternative to the copper bed warming pan. Smooth, dense river stones, the kind of rounded, fist-to-head size stones found in stream beds, were heated beside the kitchen fire for 2 to 3 hours before bedtime. A stone weighing 3 to 4 pounds, heated to the temperature of the fire's edge, retained warmth for 4 to 6 hours. Wrapped in a piece of old blanket or an old wool stocking, it could be placed at the foot of the bed, a steady, radiating source of warmth precisely where cold feet were most likely to disrupt sleep. The foot warmer was a different device, serving a different purpose. It was a small, perforated tin box, roughly 6 inches by 8 inches by 4 inches deep, containing a small ceramic or iron pot of coals. It was carried to church in winter, slipped under the feet of the congregation on the unheated stone floor, and provided a small, portable source of warmth during services that might last 2 hours or more. The foot warmer was also used in carriages placed on the floor for the feet of passengers, and at public events and markets where people stood or sat in the cold for extended periods. The people in our farmhouse kitchen wear layers, multiple layers of wool and linen, carefully selected and maintained. What they wear is as important to staying warm as the fire itself. The fire heats the room to a survivable temperature. The clothing holds that warmth close to the body, creating a microclimate of warmth against the skin that persists even when the person moves away from the hearth, goes out to the woodshed or the byre, or makes the transition from the warm kitchen to the cold bedroom above. The fundamental principle of pre-modern insulating clothing was layering multiple thin layers rather than a single thick one. The reason is the same principle that makes thatch and wool blankets effective: trapped air. Between each layer of fabric, a thin layer of still air is held. Still air does not conduct heat effectively. Each layer of clothing thus adds not only its own insulating value, but a layer of trapped air above and below it. 3 layers of moderately heavy wool with 2 layers of trapped air between them outperform a single layer of the same total thickness. Additionally, layering provides adaptability. Layers can be added or removed as conditions change, as the person moves from cold outdoor air to the warmth beside the fire and back again. Picture the layers of wool and linen on a farmhouse woman in 1720, a cold January morning, before the fire has fully warmed the kitchen. Against the skin, the linen shift. A long, loose garment reaching to the knee or below, cut with wide sleeves, made of woven flax linen. Above that, a wool flannel petticoat, plain and heavily woven. Above that, a second petticoat, this one quilted, 2 layers of wool fabric with a layer of wool batting compressed between them, stitched in a diamond or herringbone pattern to hold the batting in place. Over everything, the outer gown or dress, heavy wool, dark in colour, cut to cover all the layers beneath. Across the shoulders, a large triangular kerchief of thick wool, folded and pinned. On the feet, hand-knitted wool stockings pulled up to the knee and held with a garter, and over them, leather shoes or wooden-soled pattens for the muddy yard. On the head, a wool or linen cap. Wool was the essential fibre of pre-modern English clothing, and its dominance was not accidental. wool works in ways that no other common fiber quite replicates. The wool fiber, examined under a microscope, is covered in tiny overlapping scales, like the scales of a fish, pointing from root to tip. These scales have two properties that make wool uniquely suited to cold weather clothing. First, they trap air between the fibers, creating insulation. Second, they allow the wool fabric to absorb moisture vapor, the perspiration produced by the body, and hold it within the fiber structure rather than allowing it to saturate the fabric. A dry wool garment is an effective insulator. A saturated wool garment remains a reasonable insulator. The trapped water itself provides some thermal protection, unlike linen or cotton, which lose much of their insulating value when wet. England's sheep provided the primary raw material for this essential clothing. Different breeds produce different qualities of wool. The Cotswold sheep, grazing the limestone hills of Gloucestershire and Oxfordshire, produced a long, lustrous, relatively coarse wool, well suited to weaving into strong, durable cloth. The Leicester sheep, bred across the Midlands, produced a softer, longer stapled wool that could be combed into worsted yarn, tightly twisted, smooth, suitable for finer woven cloth. The Romney sheep of Kent produced a dense, water-resistant wool ideal for the heavy outer garments of people who worked outdoors in wet weather. The processing of raw wool from the sheep's back to finished woven cloth was a multi-stage process requiring many hours of skilled labour. Shearing was done once a year in early summer. The raw fleece was washed, scouring to remove the natural lanolin and accumulated dirt. The clean wool was then carded, drawn repeatedly between two paddles set with wire teeth, which aligned the fibres and removed tangles and vegetable matter. The carded wool was spun into yarn on a spinning wheel. The yarn was woven on a loom into cloth. The finished cloth might be fulled, pressed and beaten in water to compress the fibres and possibly dyed before being cut into garments. Imagine the scratchy warmth of woolen stockings, hand-knitted from a coarse local wool. The texture rough against the skin, the weight of them substantial as they are pulled on over cold feet on a January morning. The roughness diminishes within minutes as the wool fibres relax and conform to the foot's shape. The warmth is immediate. It is not the dry, even warmth of a heated room, but the enclosed, intimate warmth of trapped air and fibre pressing against skin, holding the body's own heat close. The wool production in an ordinary farmhouse was often at least partly domestic sheep kept for their fleece, as well as their meat and milk. The processing done by the women of the household through the long winter evenings. A single sheep produces 3 to 5 pounds of raw fleece per year. Processing that fleece from raw wool to finished cloth requires 20 to 40 hours of labour carding, spinning, weaving. A single wool blanket might represent 3 sheep's annual fleece production and 40 hours of labour. This was why clothing was precious, carefully maintained, repaired repeatedly, and passed from generation to generation. Linen was the complementary fibre to wool, not an insulator in itself, but essential as the layer closest to the skin. Linen, woven from the fibres of the flax plant, is cool against the skin when dry, and dries quickly when damp, properties that made it well suited as an undergarment against which the body's perspiration could be absorbed and evaporated. Wearing linen directly against the skin and wool over it combined the moisture management properties of the lighter fibre with the insulating properties of the heavier one. The linen shift, the fundamental undergarment worn by women throughout our period, was cut generously, wide in the body, with long sleeves reaching at minimum to the knee. It was made from bleached linen of moderate weight, washed weekly when the household's water supply and the woman's time allowed. The regular washing of linen undergarments was not a luxury but a practical necessity. Linen that absorbed body oils and perspiration over many days without washing lost its ability to dry quickly and began to carry odour that the outer wool garments, washed far less frequently, could not mask. Weekly washing of linen was hard work water heated in a copper cauldron over the fire. The linen scrubbed against a washboard, wrung by hand, hung to dry, but it was understood as an element of health and decency. Picture the linen shift beneath wool layers barely visible at the neck and wrists, where it extends slightly beyond the wool garment over it. It is the intimate foundation of the entire clothing system, the surface against which the body operates, and which the body's warmth is first captured. The specific garments of men and women in our period were distinct, but both systems followed the same layering logic. For men, the foundation was the linen shirt cut similarly to the woman's shift, long-bodied, long-sleeved, worn tucked into the breeches. Over this, a waistcoat, a close-fitting, buttoned garment with or without sleeves, made from wool or heavy linen, adding a layer of insulation over the torso. Over the waistcoat, a coat or jacket heavier wool, longer, reaching to mid-thigh or knee. Outdoors, in cold or wet weather, a great coat or heavy cloak over everything. On the legs, wool stockings were universal hand-knitted, reaching to above the knee. Breeches buckled below the knee, leaving the lower leg covered only by the stocking. This area of the leg from knee to ankle was poorly insulated by modern standards, and the stockings had to work hard. Good thick wool stockings, properly knitted with appropriate tension, provided reasonable insulation even in cold, damp conditions. Poor, thin stockings worn down by use, loosely knitted, let the cold through readily. Wool stockings pulled over feet on a cold morning, the feet stiff and cold themselves. The wool rough until it warms. Picture that simple act as the first defense against the cold that would otherwise work its way up from the ground through uninsulated footwear. The feet are the most vulnerable extremity on a flagstone floor. The stockings are the first thermal barrier. Women's leg coverings were similar. Wool stockings beneath the petticoats, garters holding them above the knee. The petticoats that fell over them provided additional insulation for the lower body. A woman in 3 petticoats on a cold day has her legs surrounded by several layers of fabric and trapped air, far better insulated than a modern person in a single layer of trousers. The head was a critical area of heat loss. The head represents roughly 10% of the body's surface area, but can account for 30 to 40% of total body heat loss in cold conditions, because the head is the one area of the body that was culturally and practically the most likely to be uncovered outdoors. Indoors, caps were worn by both men and women through much of our period. The linen or wool cap, covering the crown and ears, was not merely a fashion item. It was a meaningful, insulating device that reduced heat loss from the head during the long winter hours indoors and during the cold outdoor work of the morning and evening chores. Women's caps, the white linen caps of the farmhouse wife, with their frilled borders enclosed the hair and covered the crown. Outdoors, a wool hood or a heavy cloth bonnet covered the cap. Men wore wool caps, broad-brimmed felt hats, or the knitted wool Monmouth cap, a simple cylindrical cap knitted in the round, pulled down over the ears for ordinary work. In very cold weather, wool scarves or neckcloths were wrapped around the neck and lower face, leaving only the eyes uncovered. Imagine hands thrust into a fur muff on a cold journey, the sudden enveloping warmth around fingers that had grown stiff and painful in the January air outside. Muffs, cylinders of fur or heavy fabric, open at both ends, worn hanging from a ribbon around the neck, were a solution to the problem of the hands in cold air. The hands, fingers spread inside the muff, were surrounded by still air held by the fur or fabric. The body's own warmth accumulated in this enclosure. Mittens and gloves served similarly, though the fully enclosed mitten was warmer than the glove because the fingers shared their warmth within the mitten's single cavity, rather than each being insulated separately. The care of clothing was a significant household task. Wool garments required much less frequent washing than linen. Weekly washing in hot soapy water, as was standard for linen, would shrink and damage wool fibers, reducing the garment's lifespan dramatically. Instead, wool was aired hung outside on dry days, where fresh air circulated through the fibers, removing odor and refreshing the fabric. It was brushed, a stiff brush worked over the surface in the direction of the weave, removing surface dirt, dried mud, and loose fibers without subjecting the garment to water. It was occasionally beaten, hung over a rail, and struck with a flat wooden beater to dislodge embedded dust and flatten the fibers. And it was inspected, examined regularly for the small holes and thinning areas that would, if left unaddressed, become large holes requiring expensive patching. Darning, the repair of holes and thin areas in knitted or woven wool, was a standard skill of every woman and many men. A darned stocking, its thin heel rewoven with matching yarn in a grid pattern, was as warm as a new stocking if the repair was done well. Clothing was too valuable to discard. A coat or dress that was worn beyond further repair was dismantled, its buttons saved, its best fabric cut into smaller pieces for patches, its remnants eventually used for stuffing or binding or rag mats. Nothing was wasted. Picture careful darning of wool stockings in the evening light by the fire, the stocking pulled over a smooth wooden darning mushroom to hold the heel taut, the needle weaving warp threads across the hole and then weft threads over and under them, rebuilding the knitted structure from scratch. It is painstaking work, requiring good light and patience, but a well-darned stocking, its heel rebuilt, will last another winter. Moth protection was a constant concern for stored wool garments. The larvae of the clothes moth consumed wool fiber, creating holes that destroyed garments. Lavender bundles of dried lavender flowers, sachets of lavender sewn into small linen bags, was placed among stored wool clothing and blankets, its strong scent discouraging moths from laying eggs in the fibers. Cedar wood served a similar function, and cedar-lined storage chests were used in households wealthy enough to afford them. Strong-smelling dried herbs, rosemary, wormwood were also used. The smells of a storage chest or press where winter clothing was kept through the summer lavender, cedar, aged wool were as distinctive as any aspect of pre-modern household life. Seasonal rotation of clothing was standard practice. The heavy winter coats and petticoats were stored through the summer months in chests or presses, protected against moth and damp, brought out again in October when the cold returned. The summer clothing, lighter wool, thinner linen, was stored in its turn. A household with organized clothing storage and good moth protection could maintain its winter garments in serviceable condition for many years. The original investment in cloth and labor protected by careful management. The differences in clothing quality across social classes were stark and visible. A gentleman or wealthy farmer dressed in fine merino wool, the soft, dense wool of Spanish merino sheep, imported at considerable cost, its fineness and evenness a clear signal of the wealth required to obtain it. His great coat was lined with fur ermine at the collar, mink at the cuffs. His stockings were silk over wool, his shoes well made and regularly resoled. A day labourer's family dressed in coarse local wool, often hand-spun and hand-woven at home, the garments cut generously to allow for growth and reuse. The labourer's wife might own one set of warm winter clothing shift, petticoat, gown, shawl, and no spare. If it became wet, she wore it wet until it dried on her body. If it wore out, it was patched from other worn-out garments until patching was no longer possible. Picture the differences in dress across the social spectrum, the gentry's smooth, fine wool coat beside the labourer's rough, patched one. Both are wool. Both serve the same fundamental function, but the warmth they provide and the comfort they allow are not equal. Picture a greatcoat of heavy double-woven wool, its cape collar falling over the shoulders, worn against a January wind on the road between two villages. The coat weighs perhaps 4 or 5 pounds. It is close woven enough to shed light rain. Its dense pile traps a thick layer of still air between the fabric and the body beneath. In this coat, the wind is a presence felt but not deeply penetrating. Without it, the same wind would be immediately, sharply cold. Imagine coming in from the yard on a January morning, the outer cloak removed at the door and hung on the peg beside the entry, the layers beneath, releasing the cold of the outside air slowly, the warmth of the kitchen beginning its work on the chilled outer surfaces of wool. Within a few minutes of sitting beside the fire with the outer layer removed, the warmth has moved inward through the remaining layers, and the body temperature is restored. The system has worked exactly as it was designed to work. Picture a child's wool cap pulled low over the ears on a cold morning. The knitted wool, close-fitting, covering the crown and the tops of the ears. The child's face pink below it from the cold outside air. The cap is not decorative. It is the primary defense against the 30 to 40% of body heat that an uncovered head would lose to the cold air. A child properly capped and coated and stockinged is a child whose thermoregulatory system is not under severe stress, whose body's resources are available for growth and activity rather than diverted entirely to maintaining core temperature. Imagine the feeling of pulling a freshly wool-knitted stocking over a cold foot, the fibers slightly rough at first contact, yielding within moments as they absorb the foot's warmth and begin to relax, the enclosed warmth building quickly in the space between wool and skin. A knitted wool stocking has more air trapped in its structure than a woven fabric of similar weight, because the looped knit construction creates more void space. That trapped air is insulation. The stocking is warm before it has been worn for 5 minutes. Night falls early in January. By 5 o'clock, the farmhouse is dark. By 8 or 9, the household prepares for bed. The bed itself, how it was constructed, how it was warmed, how people slept within it, all of this was designed around the challenge of staying warm through the long, cold night. The night hours were the hardest. The fire banked low, the kitchen cooling, the unheated bedchambers cold from the moment darkness fell. The bed was the answer to the night, not a place of mere rest, but an engineered solution to the problem of maintaining body warmth for 8 or 9 hours without fire. The foundation of the pre-modern bed was the bed frame, a wooden rectangular structure of oak or elm. The side rails and end rails mortised into 4 corner posts, the whole assembled with wooden pegs rather than metal fasteners. What distinguished this frame from a modern one was what filled the interior. Not slats or a solid base, but a web of rope. Hemp rope, approximately ½ an inch in diameter, was woven back and forth across the frame in a grid pattern crossing both lengthways and crossways, pulled taut, the intersections locked by the tension of the weave. The completed rope web formed the support surface on which the mattresses rested. Picture the rope bed frame in the farmhouse bedchamber, its side rails mortise solid, the rope grid taut and slightly springy underfoot when tested. The rope web distributes the sleeper's weight across the entire surface rather than concentrating it at contact points, as a rigid surface would. It was comfortable in the manner of a hammock, yielding, conforming, with a slight movement that rocked the sleeper very gently. The expression "sleep tight" almost certainly derives from the necessity of keeping this rope web properly tensioned. A loosened web sagged in the middle, tipping the sleeper toward the center and disturbing the sleep of anyone sharing the bed. The rope key, a wooden peg used to tighten the lacing where it attached to the frame, was a standard household tool. Over the rope web lay the mattresses. A well-equipped farmhouse bed had 2, a firm lower mattress and a softer upper one. The lower mattress was typically filled with straw wheat, straw preferred, dried and bundled, stuffed into a large linen tick, the outer casing, until it was firm and resilient. A straw mattress provided some insulation between the sleeper and the cold air beneath the bed. It also provided a relatively level surface. Straw mattresses required annual replacement. The straw compressed and broke down over time, losing its spring and becoming lumpy. The old straw was removed in autumn, the tick emptied and restuffed with fresh straw from the harvest. This was a household task, done before the cold set in. The upper mattress, the feather bed, was the luxury of the pair. A good feather bed was filled with goose or duck down, the soft, fine underfeathers that provided the bird with its own insulation against cold water and cold air. A feather bed weighing 20 to 40 pounds, the weight, depending on its size and the density of the fill, was extraordinarily warm. Down feathers trap air with exceptional efficiency. Each fine filament of a down cluster is itself branched, creating a structure that captures air at multiple levels simultaneously. A well-made feather bed enveloped the sleeper in warmth that was, by the standards of the time, remarkable. Imagine the thick feather mattress, how it received the body's weight and conformed around it, the down compressing where pressure was applied and remaining lofted in the areas beside the sleeper, creating a gentle cradle of air and fibre that held warmth with extraordinary tenacity. This was not a bed for the poor. Feathers were collected over years, plucked from the household's geese and ducks several times per year, or purchased at market, and a full feather bed represented a significant household asset, valued in probate inventories and passed between generations. Poor households slept on straw alone, or on flock mattresses filled with the short, coarse fibres called flock, the waste product of wool processing. Flock was less comfortable than feather and less insulating, but available cheaply or free to households involved in woolworking. A flock mattress was better than nothing, and substantially better than straw for warmth. The height of the bed above the floor, 24 to 30 inches, was typical, was itself a form of thermal management. Cold air, being denser than warm air, settles toward the floor. The lowest 12 to 18 inches of a cold room contains the coldest air. A bed raised 24 to 30 inches above the floor places the sleeper above the coldest zone, into air that is slightly but meaningfully warmer. This was not a principle that pre-modern people would have articulated in those terms, but it was understood experientially. Sleeping closer to the floor was colder. The tester bed, the four-poster bed with a canopy and curtains, addressed the cold from another direction entirely. A tester bed was a bed enclosed on all sides by heavy fabric curtains, hanging from a wooden or metal frame attached to the tops of the four corner posts. The canopy, called the tester, stretched across the top of this frame, creating a ceiling over the sleeping space. When the curtains were drawn closed on all sides, the sleeper occupied a fabric tent, entirely enclosed. Picture drawing the bed curtains closed on a January night, heavy wool curtains, weighted at their bases so they hang straight, sliding on wooden rings along the curtain rods. As they close, the chill of the room is shut out. Within the enclosed space, the curtains immediately begin trapping the warmth generated by the sleeper's body. The tester above prevents warm air from rising away. The curtains on all four sides prevent cold room air from circulating into the sleeping space. Within the enclosure, the temperature is 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than the room outside the curtains. Breathing holes were an important detail of a well-designed bed curtain system. A fully sealed enclosure, while maximally warm, would eventually accumulate carbon dioxide from the sleeper's exhalation and become uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. Good bed curtains had small gaps by design or by imperfect fit that allowed a slow circulation of fresh air into the sleeping space without permitting cold room air to flood in. The curtains needed to be dense enough to trap warmth and diffuse enough to allow slow air exchange. Imagine the enclosed warmth of the curtained bed, the darkness complete, the sounds of the house muffled by the fabric walls, the temperature within the enclosure steadily rising as the body's heat accumulates. Within 10 to 15 minutes of drawing the curtains and settling beneath the blankets, the interior of the bed would be substantially warmer than it was when the sleeper first entered. This was not the warmth of a heated room, it was a different quality of warmth entirely. It was personal warmth, body warmth, returned and amplified by the enclosure. It was warmth that belonged entirely to the sleeper and would last as long as the sleeper remained within it. The blankets layering the sleeper within this enclosure were wool, multiple layers of them. 2 to 4 wool blankets per bed was standard for a household of middling means. Each blanket measured approximately 72 by 90 inches, 6 feet by 7.5 feet, and weighed 4 to 6 pounds. The total weight of coverings on a well-equipped winter bed, 3 blankets plus a quilted coverlet, might reach 15 to 20 pounds. This weight was not incidental. Heavy coverings pressed against the body, reducing the airspace between blanket and skin and preventing the loss of warm air from beneath the coverings when the sleeper moved. Picture the layers of heavy wool blankets, the weight of them substantial, pressing down, the texture of hand-woven wool, rough and satisfying against the hands as the blankets are drawn up. The first blanket lays directly over the sleeper. The second lies over the first, adding another layer of trapped air. The third over the second. The weight accumulates, the warmth accumulates. The combination of enclosed, curtained space and multiple wool blankets created a sleeping environment that could maintain the sleeper in genuine warmth through even a very cold night, provided the banking of the kitchen fire had been done properly and the bedchamber was not so cold that the thermal system was overwhelmed. The preparation for bed was itself a ritual of thermal management. The bed-warming pan had been applied to the sheets. The warming stone, wrapped in flannel, was placed at the foot of the bed, the position where cold feet would find it in an hour or two. The curtains were prepared for drawing. The nightclothes were laid ready, warming beside the kitchen fire for the hour before bed, so that they would be warm rather than cold when put on. Nightclothes were a practical layer of insulation specifically designed for sleep. The nightshirt worn by both men and women throughout most of our period, in different lengths and fabrics, was typically made of linen for summer and wool, or heavy linen for winter. It was cut long, reaching to the ankle or the floor, with long sleeves, the excess length tucked around and beneath the feet, adding insulation to the extremity most likely to be the first point of cold entry. A foot that was cold would keep the entire body restless. A foot warmly wrapped in nightshirt fabric and resting near the warming stone was a foot that would not disturb sleep. Picture donning the nightcap, a simple cylinder of linen or wool, fitting close over the crown and covering the ears, sometimes with a long tail that could be wrapped around the neck or tucked into the collar. The nightcap reduced heat loss from the head during sleep, the head being, as we have noted, a significant source of body heat loss. It also kept the ears warm, a comfort that anyone who has slept in a genuinely cold room appreciates in a concrete and immediate way. The nightcap was worn by both men and women, by children and the elderly, by the wealthy and the poor. It was one of those pre-modern solutions so practical and effective that it persisted long after the conditions that made it necessary had largely passed. The bedchamber itself, on that January night in 1720, was cold in a way that modern people rarely experience. The room temperature might fall to 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit overnight below freezing in a particularly cold spell, and in a room on an exterior wall without the benefit of the rising heat from the kitchen below. The windows were frosted on the inside, condensation from the room's relatively humid air freezing on the cold glass surface. Breath was visible in the lamplight when the sleeper first entered the room and prepared for bed. The floor, stone or wood, was cold underfoot. This cold was accepted as the condition of the night. The response to it was not to heat the bedchamber that would have required another fire, more fuel, more tending, but to manage it through the bed's own thermal engineering. The cold room was entered, the bed prepared, the nightclothes pulled on quickly, and the warm interior of the bed reached as rapidly as possible. The transition from the warm kitchen at the end of the evening to the warm enclosure of the bed required passing through the cold bedchamber, which was done with speed and minimal lingering. Imagine the bedroom, breath visible in lamplight, the room cold enough to see your own exhalation, the window ice on its interior surface, the floorboards cold even through thick wool stockings. The bed is there, its curtains drawn to keep its interior slightly less cold than the room itself. The warming pan was applied 20 minutes ago. The warming stone is at the foot. You change quickly, nightshirt already warm from the fireside. You climb in, draw the curtains, pull the blankets up. The enclosure closes around you. The cold of the room, visible, palpable, real, is now on the other side of the wool curtain. Within minutes, you will be warm. Sleeping arrangements in the pre-modern farmhouse were communal in ways that have no direct modern parallel. The husband and wife shared a bed. As a matter of course, the privacy of individual sleeping was a luxury of later centuries and higher social classes. Children, 2, 3, 4 of them shared beds with each other, the youngest sometimes with the parents. Body heat shared between multiple sleepers made the bed's thermal system far more effective. 2 bodies heating an enclosed space warm it substantially faster than one, and the warm air is replenished continuously. A bed containing 4 children was a warm bed, even in a very cold room. This communal sleeping was not experienced as a deprivation. It was simply the way things were, as normal and unremarkable as any other aspect of daily life. The privacy of sleep ideal that began to develop among the wealthier classes in the later 18th century was itself a luxury that required both the physical space of additional bedrooms and the additional fuel to heat. For the ordinary farmhouse family, sharing beds was warmth, companionship, and economy simultaneously. Strangers shared beds at inns and in households that took in travellers. A traveller arriving at a roadside inn in January could not expect a bed to himself. He would likely be directed to a room with 2 or 3 other travellers, sharing a bed of reasonable size. This was understood as normal hospitality and normal travel conditions. Complaints about it in the later 18th century, when expectations of privacy were beginning to change among the traveller class, were recorded with some puzzlement by innkeepers who saw nothing unusual in the arrangement. Imagine sharing the bed's warmth, the particular intimacy of a shared sleeping space, the immediate awareness of another person's warmth on the other side of the mattress, the way the accumulated warmth of 2 bodies quickly reaches a temperature that one body alone would take twice as long to achieve. This warmth was not something people spoke about directly. It was simply part of the experience of cold weather life, as natural and necessary as the fire in the kitchen below. Picture a family of 4 in 2 beds on a winter night, the parents in the larger bed, its curtains drawn, the smaller children in the trundle bed pulled from beneath the main frame and left with its own blankets. The children's combined warmth heats their shared bed rapidly, their small bodies, generating heat at a high rate relative to their size, turn the enclosed space under the blankets warm within minutes of lying down. The sound of their breathing slows as sleep comes. Imagine the particular quality of warmth inside a curtained bed in a cold room, the enclosure complete on all sides, the heavy wool curtains blocking the room's cold air, the overhead tester capturing the warmth that would otherwise have drifted toward the ceiling. The air within the curtains is still. The body's heat accumulates in that stillness. It is a different warmth from the warmth beside a fire, not directional, not variable, but even and surrounding, the warmth of your own body returned to you from every side. Back in the warm kitchen on that January morning, breakfast is being prepared over the fire. Food plays a role in staying warm not just metaphorically, but thermally and physiologically. The body generates its own heat. That heat generation is fueled by food in precisely the way that the kitchen fire is fueled by wood. A body well fed with appropriate foods in winter generates more internal heat than a poorly fed one. The households that survived cold winters in good health were not only the ones with warm walls and good fires and well-made clothing and properly prepared beds, they were also the ones that managed to eat enough of the right things. Hot food and hot drink were the most immediate and straightforward contributors to warmth. Consuming something hot, a bowl of porridge, a mug of hot ale, a cup of broth, raises the temperature of the mouth, throat, and stomach directly, and this warmth spreads through the body from the inside. The effect is temporary but real. A person coming in from the cold yard after morning chores, fingers stiff, cheeks red, the chill of the January air still on them, who sits down to a bowl of hot porridge and a cup of warm ale, undergoes a measurable and felt warming within minutes. The hot food is doing exactly what the fire does, but from within. Picture the pot of porridge simmering at the chimney crane on that January morning. Oats added to water or milk the night before and left to soak, then brought to a slow boil over the revived fire in the early morning, stirring occasionally with a long wooden spurtle to prevent sticking. Oats were the staple grain of the north and the cold months. They were filling, cheap, and their long-chain starches provided sustained energy throughout a cold working day. A bowl of porridge made from a quarter-pound of oats, served with a little salt and perhaps a splash of milk when the household's cow was producing, contained perhaps 250 to 300 calories, a reasonable portion of the morning's fuel requirement. In a cold farmhouse, with several hours of outdoor winter work ahead, that fuel was not a luxury. Pottage was the other fundamental hot food of pre-modern England, a thick, slow-cooked mixture of grains, dried peas or beans, vegetables, and whatever meat or fat was available. A pot of pottage could sit at the chimney crane for hours, gently simmering, thickening as the starch is released from the grains and legumes, the flavours deepening as the day progressed. It was ready to eat throughout the day, ladled into wooden or ceramic bowls as the household's appetite and work schedule required. A good pottage made with dried peas, barley, a ham bone, onion, and dried herbs contained enough fat, protein, and starch to sustain a person through a physically demanding cold day. Ale was the standard drink of the pre-modern English household, consumed at all meals and throughout the working day. Small ale, very low in alcohol, brewed quickly, and consumed fresh, was drunk by everyone, including children. It was not heated always, but often was. A pot of small ale set at the edge of the hearth to warm was a common morning sight. The warmth contributed directly to comfort. The modest caloric content ale is derived from grain and retains some of its nutritional value added to the body's fuel supply. Tea, which became increasingly available from the 1660s onward and was common among ordinary households by the 1740s and 1750s, was always consumed hot and became a significant source of the physiological warmth that hot liquids provide. Imagine warming hands around a mug of hot ale on a January morning, the ceramic mug itself warm to the touch, the steam rising from its surface, the warmth of it passing through the palms and up the arms as the body absorbs the heat from the vessel. This simple act holding something warm, bringing it to the lips, drinking contributed to the household's system of warmth management in a direct and felt way. The winter diet of a pre-modern English farming household was shaped by preservation and storage. Fresh food, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, fresh meat other than poultry was largely unavailable between November and April. What sustained the household through those months was food that had been preserved in summer and autumn by the available methods: salting, smoking, drying, pickling, and cold storage in root cellars and cool chambers. Salted pork was the primary meat of the winter months for most English farming families. The autumn pig killing, typically in November, when the pig had reached its maximum weight on summer and autumn pasture, and the cold weather reduced the risk of rapid spoilage, produced quantities of pork that were preserved by packing in salt. A pig of 140 to 180 pounds, live weight, yielded perhaps 100 pounds of usable meat: hams, shoulders, belly, trotters, chitterlings, lard rendered from the fat. The hams were rubbed with salt and left to cure for 6 to 8 weeks, then hung in the chimney above the smoke of the kitchen fire to take on a further preservation. A well-cured, well-smoked ham hung in the kitchen chimney could keep for 6 to 12 months. Dried peas and beans, the legumes that were the primary source of plant protein in winter, were harvested in late summer, dried in the sun or in the warmth of the barn, and stored in dry sacks or crocks. They provided not only protein but substantial calories. A cup of dried peas contains 350 or more calories, and cooked into pottage with fat and grain, they became a high-calorie, warming, sustaining food well suited to the caloric demands of cold-weather physical work. Picture the winter diet of preserved and stored foods, the ham hanging above the fire, dark and dense from curing and smoke, the sacks of dried peas and barley stacked on the pantry shelf, the turnips and carrots packed in sand in the root cellar beneath the floor, the crocks of pickled cabbage and small green walnuts preserved in brine, the hard cheese, wrapped in cloth, on the cool stone pantry shelf. This was not a diet of abundance or variety, but it was one calibrated by long experience to sustain the body through the cold months. The body's own metabolic response to cold increased the household's caloric requirements in winter. A body working to maintain its core temperature in cold air burns more calories than the same body in warm conditions, 10 to 20% more. A farm labourer performing outdoor work in January, feeding animals, hauling wood, breaking ice from the water trough, was burning perhaps 3,500 to 4,000 calories per day. That was a significant demand on the food supply. Meeting it required the carbohydrate-dense, fat-rich winter diet of bread, pottage, salt, pork, cheese, and lard. These were not foods consumed by choice. They were the foods that cold work required, and traditional dietary patterns in cold climates had evolved to provide them. Fat deserves particular emphasis. Animal fat, lard, butter, dripping from roasted meat was consumed in winter quantities that would seem extraordinary by modern standards. A labourer's daily bread might be spread thickly with lard rather than butter. A bowl of pottage might have several spoonfuls of rendered fat stirred into it. The reason was physiological. Fat is the most calorie-dense macronutrient, providing 9 calories per gram compared to 4 for protein or carbohydrate. A cold-working body needed those concentrated calories, and it used them efficiently. Fatness, in the pre-modern context, was not a health problem, it was a physical resource, a store of energy that could sustain a body through periods of cold stress and reduced food availability. The kitchen, in the cold months, was the social centre of the farmhouse. All indoor work was done in the warmest room. The woman of the household spun wool at her spinning wheel set close to the fire. The older children sat at the table doing the tasks assigned to them, carding wool, peeling vegetables for the next day's pottage, mending smaller items of clothing. The man worked at repairing harness or tool handles, the work that could not be done outdoors in cold weather. The grandmother, in her chair closest to the fire, knitted the needles clicking in the firelight, the wool from a skein hanging over the back of the chair. This was winter life, all of them in one warm room, the fire at the centre, the dark outside. Picture the family gathered for the midday meal, all of them together in the kitchen, the pot of pottage ladled into individual bowls, the bread broken and passed around the table. The meal was eaten in the warmest room, necessarily, since it was the only warm room. But this coincidence of necessity with sociality meant that meals were genuinely communal events, the entire household together around the table in the shared warmth of the kitchen fire, eating the same food, occupying the same space. The timing of meals followed the daylight as much as the clock. Breakfast at 7 or 8, after the morning chores, feeding animals, carrying water, reviving the fire, bringing in wood. Dinner at midday, the main meal of the day, the largest and most calorie-dense. Supper in the early evening, before the light fully failed, a lighter meal that used the remains of the dinner or something simple from the stored provisions. All meals in the kitchen, all meals in the warmth. The kitchen fire served the evening meal in ways that went beyond cooking. Once the supper was cleared, the family remained in the kitchen because it was the only warm place in the house. The candles were lit tallow dips, made from rendered animal fat poured into molds around cotton wicks, burning with a dim, yellowish light that was barely adequate for close work, but adequate for conversation and simple tasks. Candles were expensive relative to the household's income, which meant they were used sparingly and only when needed. Rushlights, the stems of dried rushes dipped in melted fat, producing an even dimmer light, were cheaper and served for evenings when economy was especially important. Imagine the family working by firelight in the long winter evening, the fire the primary light source as well as the primary heat source, the candles supplementing it for close work. The fire's light is warm and variable, flickering with each subtle movement of air, throwing shadows that shift across the walls and the ceiling. It is a kind of light quite different from any artificial light available today, alive, moving, responsive to every breath in the room. The faces of the family by firelight, the grandmother's face over her knitting, the children at the table were lit from below and from the side, the light catching the planes of cheekbone and brow, the shadows deep. Early bedtime was economically rational in winter. Every hour of light after dark required a candle or rushlight. Every hour, in a sitting position, rather than under blankets, consumed body heat that the bed would then have to replenish. Going to bed at 8 or 9 o'clock, when the fire was banked and the kitchen would begin to cool, was not a privation. It was the sensible management of warmth and fuel. The long winter night, 14 hours of darkness in January, was largely spent in bed, in sleep, in the warmth of the enclosed bed space where the body's own heat sustained the sleeper through the cold hours without requiring additional fuel. Picture the family working by firelight at 7 in the evening, the fire beginning to be banked for the night, the grandmother taking her knitting toward the warmest chair. Within an hour, the kitchen will be quiet, the fire banked to coals, the household in their beds. The January night, 14 hours long, cold and dark, will pass in sleep and warmth. The seasonal rhythm of life in a cold climate before modern heating was pronounced and deeply felt. Winter was a contraction. The world shrank to the warm room, the covered yard, the byre where the animals were kept. Activity slowed. The heavy outdoor work of ploughing, planting, and harvesting was done in other seasons. January was the time for indoor tasks, for rest relative to summer, for the slow indoor pace that preserved calories and kept people close to the warmth they had worked so hard to establish. Livestock required feeding and watering regardless of the cold, but the rest of the winter agricultural calendar was far less demanding than the summer one. The body itself responded to the seasonal shift appetite, increasing as the cold demanded more calories, the inclination toward rest and indoor activity strengthening as the cold made outdoor movement more costly. Modern people living in artificially warmed interiors experience little of this seasonal adjustment, but its biological basis remains present. The tendency to eat more and move less in winter, common enough to be a cultural observation, is a residue of an adaptive response that, in pre-modern conditions, had direct survival value. The animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, horses, were themselves a source of warmth in the farmhouse economy, though not in any direct way. The byre, where cattle were overwintered, was warmed by the body heat of the animals themselves. A cow generates considerable heat, roughly 5,000 BTUs per hour, comparable to a moderate electric space heater. A byre containing 4 or 5 cattle in winter was noticeably warmer inside than the outside air, warmed entirely by the animal's metabolic heat. Some farm families in very cold climates in Scotland, in the north of England, brought their most vulnerable animals into the house during the coldest spells, sharing the household's warmth with the livestock and benefiting in turn from the additional warmth the animals generated. This was practical necessity, not sentimentality. The hot food and warm drink of winter served a social function beyond pure thermal management. The The cup of warm ale offered to a visitor arriving cold from the road was a gesture of welcome that had literal thermal content. The shared meal around the kitchen fire was not only an act of nutrition but of communal warmth. Bodies in a room together generate warmth that a single body does not. 5 people in a 12 by 14-foot kitchen, each generating approximately 300 BTUs per hour of body heat, contribute 1,500 BTUs per hour to the room's warmth, not negligible, particularly in a room already being warmed by a fire. This communal warmth was extended beyond the household. Neighbours gathered for the social work events that combined labour and warmth. Spinning bees, where women from several households gathered with their spinning wheels at one house, sharing its warmth while spinning together and talking. Barn raisings, where the shared physical labour of the men generated body heat while accomplishing construction work. Harvest suppers at the farmhouse, where the combined warmth of many bodies and the kitchen fire together made a room genuinely hot in a way it could not be in any other circumstances. The tavern was a public, warm space, perhaps the most important one available to ordinary people outside their own households. The tavern fire burned continuously, maintained by the innkeeper's interest in attracting customers who wished to be warm. A farm labourer who could afford a penny for a pot of small ale could sit in a warm room for an hour, warm himself by the fire, rest legs tired from outdoor work, and experience a kind of warmth that his own cottage, particularly if he lived alone or in a household with minimal fuel, might not be providing. Taverns in the 18th century were not primarily places of drinking. They were warm public rooms where warmth was the primary commodity and the drink was the price of admission. Picture neighbours gathered for communal work, a spinning bee at the farmhouse kitchen on a January evening, 4 or 5 women from the village with their wheels and wool, the room fuller and warmer than it is on ordinary evenings, the conversation running while the wheels turned. The warmth of this gathering is social and thermal simultaneously, the two aspects of warmth inseparable in the pre-modern household economy. The most vulnerable members of the household, infants and the elderly, required special management in cold conditions. Infants had the physiological disadvantage of very high surface area to volume ratios. They lost body heat much faster than adults did, relative to their size. The cold that a healthy adult could tolerate for hours could lower an infant's core temperature to dangerous levels within minutes. The traditional practice of swaddling addressed this directly. Swaddled infants were wrapped tightly in bands of cloth linen first, then wool from the armpits to the feet, with the arms bound to the sides and the legs straight. The effect was to create a dense, tightly wrapped package that held its warmth far better than a loosely clothed infant. The swaddled bundle could be placed near the fire's warmth without risk of the infant moving toward it. It could be tucked into the bed. It could be handed between family members, passed to whoever was sitting nearest the warmth at any given moment. The tight wrapping also reduced the caloric expenditure required for the infant to maintain its body temperature, leaving more of the food it consumed available for growth. Picture the infant swaddled tightly, the small face visible above the wrapping, the expression of a creature warm and contained. The wrapping was not a restraint in any distressing sense. Infants wrapped in this way typically slept more calmly and consistently than loosely clothed ones, because warmth facilitated sleep. The cradle was placed near the fire, close enough to receive its warmth, not so close as to risk a spark reaching the swaddling. A wooden screen between the fire and the cradle was sometimes used as a precaution. Infant mortality was high in the pre-modern period, and cold was a contributing factor in a subset of winter deaths. The cold that adult bodies managed adequately could overwhelm an infant's thermoregulatory capacity. Households understood this, and the care given to keeping infants warm was deliberate and attentive, even if it was not articulated in terms of physiology. It was simply known that cold killed infants, and so infants were kept warm. The elderly faced a different vulnerability. Old age reduces the body's ability to generate heat and to detect cold accurately. Both the metabolic rate and the peripheral temperature sensation decline with age. An elderly person may feel less cold than they actually are, continuing to sit in a cooling room without feeling sufficient discomfort to move closer to the fire. When they do move to the fire, they may find it harder to re-warm a body that has been chilling for some time. The position of honor the chair closest to the hearth was given to the oldest person in the household as a matter of custom and of practical care. This was not merely respect for age, though it was that too. It was the recognition that the old person needed the fire's warmth most urgently and could least afford to sit at a distance from it. The elderly woman in her chair by the kitchen fire, her feet on a wooden footstool to keep them off the cold flags, her lap covered by a wool blanket, her shawl across her shoulders. This was a practical arrangement before it was a sentimental one. Some elderly people, in households that could manage it, slept in the kitchen itself on the coldest nights on the settle bed. A long wooden bench built beside the kitchen fire, whose hinged seat lifted to reveal a sleeping cavity beneath, or on a simple pallet brought close to the banked fire. The kitchen was the warmest room. For the person most vulnerable to cold, staying in the warmest room through the night was a rational survival decision. Winter mortality was elevated for both the very young and the very old. The causes were multiple respiratory illness exacerbated by cold, hypothermia in its various degrees, the compounding effects of cold on existing conditions, but cold was the common thread. Households that managed their fuel well, kept their beds warm, and ensured that infants and the elderly were prioritized in the distribution of warmth had better winter outcomes than those that did not. Picture an elderly woman in her chair closest to the hearth, her feet on the wooden footstool, her lap covered by a thick wool blanket, her hands folded over the knitting she has set aside. The fire is 2 feet from her. Its warmth reaches her directly. She can feel the radiated heat against her face and the front of her garments. Her back, turned to the room, is cooler. The settle behind her chair blocks the draft from the door, but the room air is cold. She sits in a band of warmth between the fire ahead and the cooler room behind, occupying the precise zone where the fire's output is most useful. Imagine the relief of coming in from outdoor work on a January afternoon, the cold of the fields and the yard still on the clothing and the face, the hands stiff and slow, and sitting down in the kitchen. The fire's warmth reaches you immediately. The contrast between outside and inside is abrupt and physical. The cold recedes from your face first, then from your hands, then from the outer surfaces of your clothing. Within 10 minutes, the worst of the chill has been absorbed by the room and the fire, and the body has stopped its most urgent thermoregulatory effort. Within 20 minutes, a cup of hot broth has been brought, and the warmth is now coming from inside as well as outside. Picture the kitchen in the last hour before bed, the fire banked down to coals, the lamp trimmed and burning low, the family gathering their things for the night. The children are already sleepy. The grandmother has closed her eyes in her chair. The day's work is done. The warmth that has been maintained since dawn, the fire tended, the wood brought in, the food cooked, the clothing managed, the beds prepared will now be consolidated in the sleeping bodies of the household through the long, cold night. Our stone farmhouse in January 1720 stands as it has stood for perhaps a century. The fire burns in the kitchen. The walls hold what warmth they can. The people inside have survived another winter night and face another winter day. They will do what they do every day: tend the fire, feed the animals, prepare the food, wear the layers, bank the fire again at night, and sleep in their prepared beds. Tomorrow will be the same, and the day after. From October until April, this is the work. What we have traced through this account is not a story of suffering heroically endured. It is a story of solutions, practical, tested, refined solutions to a universal problem. Every culture that has ever inhabited a cold climate has developed its own version of this technology. The Scandinavians developed the closed iron stove, far more efficient than the English open hearth centuries before it became common in England. The Japanese developed the kotatsu, a low table over a heat source covered by a thick blanket, around which the family sat with their legs beneath the blanket, sharing the warmth of a single small heat source far more efficiently than a fire that heated an entire room. The indigenous peoples of the Arctic developed the igloo, whose curved interior shape and compacted snow walls achieve thermal performance that modern insulation engineers find impressive on analysis. In England, the solution was the system we have described: thick walls, small windows, single heated rooms, continuous fires, layered wool clothing, enclosed beds, warm food, and the communal sharing of warmth between bodies in close proximity. None of these was invented. All of them evolved over centuries from the accumulated practical wisdom of people who could not afford to get it wrong. The knowledge embedded in these practices was not primitive, it was sophisticated. A pre-modern householder managing the thermal performance of a stone farmhouse through a cold winter was applying, without naming them, principles of heat transfer, thermal mass, convection, radiation, and insulation that it would take formal science centuries to articulate precisely. She knew that wet wood burned badly. She knew that a 14-inch stone wall held warmth better than an 8-inch one. She knew that a curtained bed was warmer than an open one. She knew that wool kept warmth against the skin even when damp, and that linen did not. She knew that the coals had to be raked before banking, that the ash had to cover them at the right depth, that the morning kindling had to be dry. This was not knowledge found in books. Books were rare and expensive. Literacy was partial, and the technical details of fire management and building construction were not the subjects of published works available to ordinary farm households. The knowledge was embodied, carried in the hands and habits of people who had learned it from people who had learned it before them. An inheritance of practical intelligence passed through demonstration and repetition, one generation to the next, for hundreds of years. The losses of that knowledge are real. Most modern people cannot bank a fire. Most cannot start one with flint and steel. Most cannot assess whether a cord of wood has been seasoned long enough to burn well, or identify the sound of a chimney with dangerous creosote build-up, or read the morning fire to know whether the banking was done correctly the night before. These skills, so intimate to the daily life of millions of people for centuries, have become specialist knowledge or historical curiosity. The world that produced them is gone. But the intelligence that produced them, the patient, practical, experience-based intelligence of people solving real problems with available materials, has not gone. It persists in the architecture of every old farmhouse that still stands, in the thickness of its walls, in the smallness of its windows, in the position of its hearth. The social dimensions of pre-modern warmth management deserve reflection. Warmth was not private property in the way that modern warmth is paid for through an individual energy bill, controlled by an individual thermostat, available as a matter of course to the individual household regardless of what neighbours have or lack. Pre-modern warmth was more communal. The household's fire warmed the family, and might warm a cold neighbour who came in from the road. The tavern fire warmed the community. The church foot warmer was a shared device. The communal work events, the spinning bees, the harvests, the barn raisings, were warm because many people were together. The inequality of warmth was also stark. A wealthy household, a prosperous farmer, a country gentleman kept a fire in the parlour as well as the kitchen, perhaps a fire in the master bedroom, certainly an adequate fuel supply through even the hardest winter. Their beds were feather mattresses within curtained four-posters. Their clothing was fine wool, perhaps silk-lined, certainly adequate in layer and weight. They were warm in winter, in a way that was genuinely comfortable. The labouring family was warm enough, or tried to be. 4 cords of wood per winter required more labour and more money than a family with 1 earner and 4 children could always readily find. A household short of fuel in February faced hard choices. Going to bed earlier than usual, retreating to the relative warmth of the bed because the kitchen was becoming too cold to bear was a response to fuel shortage. Borrowing fuel from a neighbor, or accepting it as charity from the farmer who employed the family, was common. The relationship between warmth and social position was direct. More money meant, more fuel meant, more warmth meant, more comfort meant, better health outcomes through the cold months. Women carried the largest share of the daily labor of warmth management. The fire, its tending, its banking, its morning revival was women's work. The procurement of kindling, the management of the fuel supply by the hearth, the cooking over the fire, the warming of beds, all of this fell primarily within the sphere of work assigned to women in the pre-modern household. The spinning and weaving of wool, the knitting of stockings, the making and maintenance of garments, the care of infants, and the elderly who were most vulnerable to cold, these too were women's responsibilities. The system of warmth that kept the household alive and functioning was substantially a system built and maintained by women's labor, performed daily, without recognition as skilled work, and without compensation beyond the household's survival. This is worth naming plainly. The knowledge described throughout this account, fire management, wool processing, clothing construction, food preservation, bed preparation, was primarily held by women. It was passed from mother to daughter. It was applied daily by women, and it was the foundation of household survival through the cold months. When social historians of the 18th and 19th centuries wrote about household management or domestic economy, they were describing, in the abstract language of the period, a body of intensely practical knowledge and labor that made ordinary life possible in cold climates. The world of our stone farmhouse in 1720 was not static. Changes were already underway that would transform household heating over the next century and a half. The iron cooking stove, a closed, efficient device that enclosed the fire entirely and used it far more effectively than the open hearth, was being developed in continental Europe and would arrive in England in improved forms through the later 18th. Benjamin Franklin's famous stove of 1741 was one iteration of this effort to enclose the fire and direct its heat more efficiently into the room. Franklin's original design was not a great commercial success, but the principle that an enclosed iron stove was far more efficient than an open hearth was correct and gradually prevailed. Coal grates, increasingly common from the later 17th century in urban households with access to coal, transformed the urban hearth. A coal grate, the iron basket that held the coal and allowed air to enter from beneath, concentrated the coal fire's heat and directed it forward into the room more effectively than a wood fire on a flat hearth. The Rumford fireplace, designed by the American-born physicist Count Rumford at the end of the 18th century, reduced the smoke and dramatically improved the heat efficiency of the fireplace opening through scientific analysis of the hearth's geometry. These improvements, the grate, the Rumford design, and eventually the closed kitchen range that became standard in Victorian households, represent the slow, empirical engineering of the household fire toward greater efficiency. The Victorian kitchen range, a closed iron cooking and heating device fueled by coal, with an oven, hot plates, and a back boiler to heat water, was by the 1870s a standard fitting in middle-class urban households. It was not central heating in the modern sense, but it was a major improvement in efficiency and control. The first true central heating systems, using a boiler to heat water, circulated through pipes to radiators in individual rooms, appeared in grand houses and institutions from the early 19th century, but did not penetrate ordinary middle-class housing until the 1880s and 1890s, and rural and working-class housing much later still. The transformation, when it came, was profound. The household that had organized its entire physical and social life around the single warm room was liberated. Each room could be warm, The bedroom no longer required the engineering of enclosed beds and multiple blankets. The transition from kitchen to bedroom was no longer the cold crossing it had been. Children did not need to share beds for warmth. The elderly did not need the chair nearest the fire. The carefully banked fire that had been the last task of each evening was no longer necessary. What was gained was comfort, convenience, and most importantly, freedom from the constant management burden that the old system required. A household that does not need to tend a fire is a household freed of hours of daily labor. The wood does not need to be cut and split and stacked. The banking does not need to be done correctly every night. The morning revival does not need to be performed at dawn in a cold kitchen before anything else can begin. What was lost was less easily named. Some of it was knowledge, the knowledge of fire management, of wool processing, of the building principles that made thick walls an asset rather than an inconvenience. Some of it was the communal intensity of life in a single warm room, the evenings by the fire, everyone together, the social world created by the necessity of shared warmth. Some of it was the physical competence required by the old system, the strength of arms that split wood, the dexterity of hands that banked fires and managed pot cranes and darned wool stockings by firelight. And some of what was lost was a direct sensory understanding of warmth as a resource, something worked for, achieved, managed carefully, and appreciated with the particular gratitude of someone who knows exactly how much labor and skill and material it represents. The methods described in this account sustained millions of human beings through winter after winter for hundreds of years in England and for millennia in cold climates across the world. Until very recently, within the living memory of people still alive today, large portions of the English rural population were managing cold with versions of the old system: the stone walls, the open fire, the banked coals, the enclosed bed. The farmhouse of 1720 would have been recognizable in its fundamentals to a farmhouse of 1820, and partly recognizable to one of 1920 in a remote rural area. The resilience this required was real. The skill was real. The intelligence embedded in those thick walls and those curtained beds and those carefully managed fires was real. Our ancestors were not less intelligent for lacking thermostats. They were applying their intelligence to a harder problem with more limited materials, and doing it well enough to survive, generation after generation, in conditions that most modern people would find genuinely challenging. The warmth we have tonight, the even, consistent, thermostat-controlled warmth of a heated house, was purchased not just with money, but with the accumulated engineering and social change of 3 centuries. It rests ultimately on the foundation of what the woman in the stone farmhouse in January 1720 knew how to do: build a fire, keep it burning, bank it for the night, and rise in the morning to revive it. That knowledge, patient, practical, necessary, was the beginning of everything that came after. The morning light grows stronger through the small windows of the farmhouse. The household goes about the work of the day. The fire continues to burn. The methods they use, the architecture, the fuel, the fire management, the clothing, the bed preparation, the food, all of these together make survival possible in a world without thermostats, without central heating, without the constant, reliable warmth that we now assume as normal. For them, staying warm was work. Daily, constant, essential work. The work of living. Picture the stone farmhouse from the lane on a January morning, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, steady thread. The small windows showing the faint warmth of the kitchen fire within. The thick walls holding their stored warmth against the cold air outside. Nothing dramatic, nothing extraordinary. Only a house managing its warmth as it has managed it every winter for 100 years. The knowledge of how to do so residing not in any document but in the hands and habits of the people inside. Imagine the particular quality of pre-modern warmth, warmth that was worked for, achieved through skill and effort and attention, warmth that was understood as a resource with a cost and a limit. It was a different relationship to warmth than the one we have today, not inferior, different. The warmth felt beside a fire that you cut and split and stacked yourself, that you started with flint and steel, that you tended all day and banked carefully at night, is a warmth with weight and texture and history. It belongs to you in a way that the warmth from a thermostat does not. Picture a hand held out toward a fire on a January morning, the radiated heat reaching the palm, warming the fingers that were cold minutes ago, the particular gratitude of a body that knows what cold is and recognizes what warmth is worth. Good night.